Imagine a place hidden deep in the Maine wilderness, a stone sanctuary run by three women who claimed they could heal the soul. Between 1798 and 1835, nearly 600 women entered seeking spiritual peace, but fewer than half ever returned. Those who did came back broken, silent, and terrified of prayer. The rest vanished without graves, records, or answers. What truly happened behind those stone walls, and how did this horror stay hidden for decades? If stories like this give you chills, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next dark chapter from history. And tell me in the comments, which state are you watching from?
In the year 1798, when much of Maine was still wild and untouched, there existed a place so hidden that even seasoned hunters avoided it. Dense trees stood close together like a wall, blocking sunlight and sound. Beyond those trees, deep in the wilderness, stood a stone sanctuary that did not appear on any official map. The people who lived nearby spoke of it only in whispers. They said the land itself felt heavy, as if it remembered something terrible. The sanctuary was built from gray stone, rough and cold, rising out of the forest as if it had grown there naturally. No one could remember when construction began. There were no records, no town meetings, no permissions granted. One day, it was simply there. The structure looked more like a fortress than a place of worship. Small windows sat high in the walls, too narrow for anyone to climb through. Thick wooden doors were reinforced with iron, always closed, always guarded. 3 women lived inside and ruled the sanctuary. They called themselves servants of God. They dressed in plain, dark clothing and kept their heads covered. Their voices were calm and gentle, but something about them made people uneasy. They spoke slowly, choosing their words carefully, and when they looked at someone, it felt as if they could see straight into the soul. No one knew where they came from. When asked about their past, they said only that God had sent them. At a time when life was hard and medicine was limited, many people were desperate for help. Women in particular suffered quietly. Grief, illness, depression, and trauma were often labeled as weakness or sin. The 3 women of the sanctuary claimed they could heal all of this. They said pain came from impurity of the soul and that true faith could cleanse it. Their message spread from village to village, carried by preachers, traders, and travelers. Families began bringing women to the edge of the forest. Some came willingly, believing they would find peace. Others were sent by husbands or fathers who believed the sanctuary would fix them. The women were told they would be healed through prayer, silence, and devotion. They were promised safety, food, and spiritual rebirth. Once they crossed the tree line and entered the sanctuary grounds, they were not allowed to turn back. The sanctuary demanded complete separation from the outside world. Letters were forbidden. Visits were denied. The 3 women taught that contact with loved ones weakened faith and delayed healing. Families were told this was necessary, that the process was sacred and could not be interrupted. Most trusted them. After all, religion held great power during this time, and questioning it was seen as dangerous. Inside the sanctuary, life followed strict rules. Days began before sunrise and ended after dark. Silence was enforced for long hours. Meals were small and plain, described as holy fasting. The women were taught that hunger brought clarity and pain brought purity. Those who questioned the rules were told they were resisting God. Fear slowly replaced faith. From the outside, the sanctuary appeared peaceful. Smoke rose from chimneys, bells rang for prayer, but strange things began to worry the nearby towns. Women who entered were rarely seen again. Months passed, then years. Families asked when their daughters or wives would return. The answer was always the same: healing takes time. Some women, they said, chose to stay forever, giving their lives fully to God. Occasionally, a woman did leave the sanctuary. When she returned home, she was not the same. Her eyes were distant. Her body was weak and thin. She avoided churches, refused to speak of faith, and reacted in fear to prayers. When asked what happened inside, she would either fall silent or beg not to be questioned. Some claimed they were warned never to speak, that terrible things would happen if they did. The forest around the sanctuary seemed to change as well. Animals avoided the area. Hunters reported hearing chanting late at night, echoing through the trees. Sometimes screams were heard, sharp and sudden, then cut off completely. When people went to investigate, they found nothing. The sanctuary doors remained closed, and the three women denied everything. They said the sounds were part of spiritual cleansing rituals and that outsiders could not understand. As years passed, the number of women who entered continued to grow. By the early 1800s, dozens had disappeared from records. Church logs listed them as sent for healing. No death certificates were filed, no graves were marked. It was as if these women had simply vanished from the world. Some locals tried to warn others. They spoke of shadows moving behind the sanctuary windows at night. They spoke of foul smells drifting through the forest. But fear kept most silent. The sanctuary had powerful supporters, including respected religious figures who believed the three women were doing God's work. To speak against them was to risk being labeled sinful or mad. The wilderness protected the sanctuary. Roads were poor and travel was dangerous. Authorities rarely visited such remote areas. The three women understood this and used isolation as their shield. Behind stone walls and ancient trees, they were free to rule without question. By 1835, the sanctuary had been operating for nearly 40 years. Nearly 600 women had entered its gates. Fewer than half ever returned. The land around the sanctuary felt cursed, and yet the building still stood strong, untouched by fire or storm. It watched silently as families mourned without answers. This was the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Maine for generations. A place built in the name of faith, hidden beyond the trees, where healing was promised, but suffering was delivered. And this was only the surface. What truly happened inside those stone walls was far darker than anyone yet imagined.
No official records ever named the three women who ruled the sanctuary. To the outside world, they were simply known as the Sisters. They never used family names, never spoke of childhoods, and never mentioned where they were born. When questioned, they claimed their past lives had been erased by God so they could serve a higher purpose. This answer, vague and unsettling, was often enough to stop further questions. The sisters appeared to be in their 40s when the sanctuary first opened in 1798. What disturbed people most was that they seemed unchanged decades later. While others aged, bent, and weakened with time, the sisters looked almost the same. Their faces remained pale and smooth, their posture straight, their movements slow but controlled. Some locals whispered that they had found a way to escape time itself. Others said God had preserved them as a sign of holiness. Each sister had a role. The eldest spoke during sermons. Her voice was soft but carried authority. She spoke often about sin, obedience, and suffering as a path to purity. She believed the soul could only be cleansed through pain and complete surrender. The second sister managed daily life inside the sanctuary. She enforced rules, assigned prayers, and decided punishments. The youngest rarely spoke at all. She watched, she listened, and many women later said she frightened them the most. From the beginning, the sisters demanded absolute control. Women who entered the sanctuary were told to forget their old names. Names, they said, were tied to sin and past weakness. Each woman was given a new name, chosen by the sisters, often biblical or symbolic. This act alone broke many emotionally. It erased identity and made resistance harder. The sisters taught that women were naturally impure and easily led astray. They claimed the outside world poisoned the soul through love, freedom, and desire. Only isolation, silence, and strict discipline could bring salvation. Any doubt was labeled temptation. Any question was called rebellion against God. Prayer inside the sanctuary was constant. Women prayed standing, kneeling, and sometimes lying face down on cold stone floors for hours. If someone collapsed from exhaustion, they were told it was proof their soul was weak. The sisters showed no comfort. Compassion, they said, spoiled the cleansing process. Punishments were disguised as spiritual lessons. A woman who spoke without permission might be forced into silence for days. Someone who cried at night could be denied food. Those who tried to escape were taken away and never seen again. The sisters claimed these women had failed spiritually and were sent back into the world, but no one ever saw them return home. The sisters rarely raised their voices. That was part of their power. Calm words delivered fear more deeply than shouting. Women learned to obey not because they were beaten openly, but because they were convinced resistance would damn their souls forever. Visitors were not allowed inside the sanctuary. Families were stopped at the gates and spoken to through the doors. The sisters always smiled. They always reassured. She is healing. God is working through her pain. When families asked to see their loved ones, they were told that doubt interfered with the process. Many left feeling ashamed for questioning holy women. Some women arrived already broken by grief or illness. The sisters used this weakness skillfully. They listened closely at first, offering sympathy and gentle words. Then slowly they twisted that trust. They convinced the women their suffering was punishment for hidden sins. Confession became a weapon. Secrets shared in private were later used against them. The sisters kept detailed journals. These books were never shown to outsiders. They recorded confessions, punishments, and what they called failures. Later discoveries would suggest these failures were women who resisted too strongly, women who would not fully submit. Over time, rumors began spreading beyond the forest. People spoke of strange lights inside the sanctuary at night. They spoke of chanting that did not sound like Christian prayer. Some claimed to see the sisters walking the grounds long after midnight, barefoot, circling the building again and again. Despite growing fear, the sisters were protected by religion and distance. Churches supported them, believing they were helping troubled women. Authorities avoided the area, seeing no clear crimes and no complaints from inside. After all, the women inside had no voice. Those who did leave the sanctuary told similar stories, though they rarely spoke openly. They described the sisters as not fully human, as if something behind their eyes was missing. They said the sisters seemed to enjoy suffering, calling it holy work. Some survivors claimed the sisters spoke of God in ways that felt wrong, twisted, and cruel. As years passed, fewer women left the sanctuary alive. The sisters blamed this on weak faith and increasing sin in the world. They said God demanded greater sacrifices. Their sermons became darker, focused more on punishment than healing. By the early 1800s, the sisters had complete control. No one challenged them. No one entered without permission. The sanctuary became their world, sealed off from law, family, and mercy. What began as a place of supposed healing had transformed into something else entirely. And behind the calm voices, behind the stone walls, the true nature of the sisters was slowly being revealed, not as holy servants of God, but as women who had learned to hide cruelty behind faith.
Between 1798 and the early 1830s, the stone sanctuary in the Maine wilderness became a place of quiet movement. Wagons arrived at the forest's edge almost every month. Some came from nearby towns, others traveled for days from distant settlements. Inside those wagons were women of all ages, young girls barely past childhood, wives worn down by hard lives, widows broken by grief, and women labeled troubled simply because they did not obey society's rules.
The sisters welcomed them all. Word had spread that the sanctuary could heal what doctors could not. People believed it could cure sadness, madness, sinful thoughts, and even rebellion. In a time when women had little voice, many were sent there not because they wanted help, but because someone else wanted them gone. Husbands claimed their wives were disobedient. Fathers said their daughters were uncontrollable. Churches said certain women were spiritually weak. The sanctuary became the solution. Each woman who arrived was greeted at the gates by the sisters. They spoke kindly at first. They promised peace. They promised forgiveness. They promised that pain would end. Families were comforted by these words. Many cried with relief, believing they were doing the right thing. Few ever imagined it might be the last time they would see their loved one. Once inside, the women were cut off completely. Letters they tried to write were collected and never sent. Gifts from families were refused. The sisters taught that outside love was dangerous, that it pulled the soul backward. Women were told their families had abandoned them to God and that longing for home was a sign of weakness. As the years passed, the number of women inside the sanctuary quietly grew. New sleeping quarters were added. Underground rooms were expanded. Still, from the outside, the building looked unchanged. The sisters were careful. They did not draw attention. They did not celebrate. They did not invite visitors. Everything happened quietly, behind stone walls and tall trees. By 1810, dozens of women had entered. By 1820, the number was in the hundreds. Records from nearby churches showed a pattern. Women were marked as sent for healing, but no later notes recorded their return. No deaths were reported, no marriages, no children. It was as if these women had stepped out of history itself. Families began asking questions. At first, they were patient. They trusted the sisters. Healing, they were told, took time. Some were told their loved ones had chosen to stay, giving their lives fully to God. Others were told not to interfere with divine work. Many accepted these answers because they wanted to believe them. But time passed, years passed. Mothers grew old, waiting for daughters who never returned. Children grew up, never seeing their mothers again. The silence became unbearable. Occasionally, a woman did leave the sanctuary. When this happened, news spread quickly. Families rushed to see her. But the reunion was never joyful. The woman who returned was thin, weak, and distant. Her eyes avoided contact. She spoke little. She startled at loud sounds and became fearful when religion was mentioned. When asked what had happened inside, most said nothing. Some shook their heads and cried. Others whispered that they were not allowed to speak, that something terrible would happen if they did. A few said only one sentence before refusing to talk further. It was not a place of God. These women carried marks on their bodies, scars on wrists, bruises that never fully healed, signs of long hunger. Doctors had no explanation. Churches did not ask too many questions. It was easier to believe these women were simply broken than to accept the truth. By the mid-1820s, rumors could no longer be ignored. Hunters spoke of seeing women working the land in silence, watched closely by the sisters. Some said they saw women digging late at night. Others claimed to hear crying beneath the ground, muffled and distant. The forest itself seemed to resist the sanctuary. Trees near the stone walls grew twisted. Animals avoided the area. Even birds were rarely seen above the building. Locals said the land felt wrong, as if it had been poisoned. Still, women kept coming. By the end of the sanctuary's operation, nearly 600 women had entered its gates. Fewer than half ever returned. No official explanation existed for the rest. They were not listed as dead. They were not listed as alive. They were simply gone. The sisters explained this away calmly. They claimed some women failed spiritually and were sent away to live in silence elsewhere. They said others had ascended beyond earthly life.
These answers made little sense, but questioning holy women was dangerous in that era. Faith was power, and the sisters knew how to use it. What frightened people most was the pattern. The women who disappeared were often those who resisted, those who questioned rules, those who tried to escape. The obedient sometimes survived, the defiant almost never did. By 1830, whispers turned into fear. Parents warned their daughters. Some towns refused to send anyone to the sanctuary. But by then, the sisters had already taken so much. The missing women had become ghosts, spoken of quietly, remembered in prayer, but never truly acknowledged. The sanctuary continued to stand, unchanged and silent, as if guarding its secrets. The trees around it grew thicker, paths vanished, nature itself seemed to help hide what lay inside. This part of the story marked the moment when the truth became impossible to ignore. 600 women entered seeking healing, hundreds never came home, and those who did returned broken, silent, and afraid. Something terrible was happening beyond the trees, and the world was only beginning to realize it.
When the first women began returning from the sanctuary, families felt relief mixed with fear. These women were proof that leaving was possible, yet they also carried something unsettling back with them. The change in them was immediate and impossible to ignore. They walked slowly, as if their bodies were unfamiliar to them. Their eyes were hollow, often fixed on the ground. They avoided touch, even from mothers and sisters who rushed forward to embrace them. At first, families believed time would heal everything. They thought rest, food, and love would slowly bring the women back to themselves. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing changed. The women remained distant. Some barely spoke at all. Others whispered in short sentences, never finishing a thought. At night, many screamed in their sleep, waking in terror, shaking and sweating, begging for forgiveness without knowing why. Religion, once a source of comfort, now filled them with fear. The sound of church bells caused panic. Prayers made them tremble. Some refused to enter churches altogether. Others became angry or broke down crying at the mention of God. This confused their families deeply. The sanctuary was supposed to heal faith, not destroy it. Doctors examined the women, but could not explain what they saw. The women were severely underweight. Their hands showed signs of long restraint. Their backs were scarred from hard labor. Some had difficulty standing for long periods, as if they had been forced to kneel or remain still for hours at a time. Yet when doctors asked questions, the women fell silent or begged them to stop. A few women tried to speak. They started sentences, then froze, their faces filled with fear. Some covered their mouths as if afraid words themselves were dangerous. One woman repeated the same phrase again and again. "Do not ask me. Please do not ask me." Another said only, "They are listening," before refusing to say more. Families noticed that the women followed strict habits even after returning home. They woke before sunrise, knelt for long periods, and refused food as if fasting were required. Some punished themselves for small mistakes, whispering apologies to an unseen presence. It was as if the sanctuary had followed them home. Neighbors began comparing stories. Quietly, away from churches and officials, they spoke of similarities. The same fear, the same silence, the same physical weakness, the same refusal to talk. It became clear these women were not simply ill, they were deeply traumatized. One woman, older than most, eventually shared fragments of her experience. She spoke late at night, shaking, asking repeatedly if the doors were locked. She said the sanctuary was built to break people, not heal them. She described endless prayers meant to exhaust the mind. She spoke of darkness, of being kept underground for days, of voices chanting until sleep became impossible. Then she stopped speaking altogether and never mentioned it again. The sisters denied everything. When confronted with the condition of the returned women, they said healing was painful. They claimed the women were resisting God and had left before the process was complete. According to the sisters, the damage came from weakness, not from the sanctuary itself. Church leaders supported them. They said true faith required suffering. They warned families not to spread doubt or fear. Many families felt trapped. If they spoke out, they risked being labeled sinful or insane. In that time, reputation meant survival. Some women returned pregnant. No one could explain how. The sisters claimed it was divine punishment or a test of faith. Families were horrified. The women refused to explain, their shame and fear overwhelming them. These cases were quickly buried by churches and never officially recorded. As more women returned in broken states, fewer were allowed to leave. The sisters tightened control. They claimed the outside world was poisoning faith and that silence was necessary. Those who tried to leave were punished. Those who questioned were isolated. The number of returning women dropped sharply. The forest became quieter. Fewer wagons arrived to collect daughters or wives. Instead, families received vague messages through church leaders. Healing was ongoing, prayer was required, patience was demanded. Many waited until death for answers that never came. Children who grew up without mothers began asking questions. They wanted to know where their mothers were buried. There were no graves, no records, no proof they had ever existed beyond fading memories. The women who returned lived difficult lives. Some never married. Some could not care for themselves. Many were sent to relatives far away to hide their condition. Society had no words for trauma then. These women were often called cursed or weak-minded. Few received kindness. Years later, when historians studied these cases, they noticed something chilling. The women who returned were often those who fully obeyed, those who submitted completely. Those who resisted disappeared entirely. This suggested survival came at the cost of the self. By the early 1830s, the sanctuary had become a place people feared but could not stop. It existed in a gray space between religion and law, protected by distance, silence, and belief. The women who returned were living evidence that something terrible was happening, yet their fear kept the truth hidden. They were the broken witnesses of a hidden horror. Their silence was not consent, it was survival. And through them, the world caught its first clear glimpse of the darkness behind the stone walls. But the worst truths were still buried, and the sanctuary was not finished.
Inside the stone sanctuary, life followed a pattern designed to erase the self. Women woke before the sun, long before birds or light touched the forest. A bell rang once, low and heavy, and every woman was expected to rise immediately. Those who moved too slowly were marked as disobedient. There was no warmth in the mornings. Cold stone floors greeted bare feet, and silence was required from the first breath of the day. Prayer began at once, not gentle prayer, but long, exhausting sessions meant to drain the body and empty the mind. Women knelt for hours, heads bowed, hands pressed together until fingers went numb. If someone shifted or collapsed, she was pulled back into position. Pain, the sisters taught, was proof that the soul was being cleansed. Tears were welcomed. They were called signs of sin leaving the body. Food was given sparingly. Meals were small and tasteless, often just bread and water. Hunger was praised. The sisters said a full stomach weakened faith and invited sinful thoughts. Women who complained were accused of selfishness. Some were denied food completely for days as punishment, told that God would sustain them if they were worthy. Silence ruled the sanctuary. Women were not allowed to speak unless spoken to. Conversations between them were forbidden. This isolation broke bonds quickly. Without shared words, trust faded. Each woman became alone. even when surrounded by others. The sisters moved among them, watching closely, listening for whispers, studying faces for doubt. Confession was a daily requirement. Women were forced to admit sins, real or imagined. If someone claimed she had nothing to confess, she was accused of lying. The sisters pushed harder, digging into memories, twisting grief and fear into guilt. Private pain became public shame. Confessions were remembered and later used as weapons. Work filled the remaining hours. Women cleaned endlessly, scrubbed stone floors until their hands bled, carried heavy loads of wood, and worked fields in silence. Some were sent underground to dark rooms where they performed tasks without light or rest. They were told darkness brought humility. In truth, it brought fear and disorientation. Punishment rooms existed beneath the sanctuary. Women later described narrow spaces where they were locked alone for days, no light, no sound except distant chanting. Some were forced to kneel on stone for hours. Others were restrained, their hands bound, their bodies left in painful positions until muscles failed. The sisters never called this cruelty, they called it correction. Rituals took place at night. Candles lined stone walls, casting shadows that moved like living things. Chanting filled the halls, low and constant. Women were forced to stand for long periods while prayers were repeated again and again until words lost meaning. Sleep was rare. Exhaustion became a tool of control. Any woman who questioned these practices was labeled dangerous. The sisters said doubt spread like disease. Those women were separated from the others. Sometimes they were taken underground. Sometimes they were never seen again. When others asked where they went, the sisters said they had failed spiritually and were sent away to reflect. No one ever returned from this reflection. The sisters kept order through fear, but also through belief. They convinced women that leaving meant damnation. They said the outside world was sinful and cruel. They said families had given them up. Over time, many women believed this. The sanctuary became their entire world, even as it destroyed them. The stone walls hid everything. From the outside, the sanctuary looked calm, even holy. Smoke rose from chimneys. Bells rang for prayer. But inside, time lost meaning. Days blended together. Seasons passed unnoticed. Women forgot their own ages. Some forgot their real names entirely. The sisters allowed no records of death. Women who died were not buried in marked graves. Their bodies were taken away quietly, usually at night. Other women were told to pray harder so they would not share the same fate. Fear deepened. Obedience increased. Illness spread easily in such conditions. Weak bodies fell sick. The sisters claimed illness was punishment for impure thoughts. Medical care was forbidden. Prayer was the only treatment. Many women died slowly, untreated, and alone. The sanctuary's design made escape nearly impossible. Thick walls, locked doors, and constant supervision trapped everyone inside. The forest beyond was dense and dangerous. Women were told wild animals would kill them if they tried to flee. Some believed it. Others were too weak to try. The sisters presented themselves as calm and righteous through it all. They never appeared tired. They never showed doubt. Their control was absolute. Women learned that survival depended on obedience, silence, and surrender of identity. Years passed this way. The sanctuary became less a place of worship and more a system of slow destruction. The sisters refined their methods. They removed mercy entirely. Healing was no longer the goal. Control was. By the time outsiders began to suspect something truly wrong, the damage was already deep. Inside the stone walls, women were no longer individuals. They were shadows moving through ritual and pain, their former lives erased.
What happened behind those walls was not faith, it was imprisonment disguised as holiness. And the deeper one looked, the clearer it became that the sanctuary was built not to save souls, but to break them.
As the years passed, the forest around the sanctuary began to tell its own story. People who lived nearby noticed changes they could not explain. Paths that once felt safe now felt heavy and silent. Hunters avoided the area, saying their animals refused to go near the stone walls. Even experienced woodsmen said something about the land felt wrong, as if it was watching them. At night, strange sounds drifted through the trees. Low chanting echoed far beyond the sanctuary grounds, carried by the wind. Sometimes the chanting grew louder, mixed with cries that sounded like women screaming. These sounds were not brief, they lasted for hours, then suddenly stopped, leaving the forest unnaturally quiet. Those who heard them said the silence afterward felt worse than the noise. Fires were sometimes seen late at night. Orange light flickered through the small sanctuary windows, even when no prayers were scheduled. Smoke rose thick and dark, carrying a sharp smell that did not resemble wood. People whispered that something was being burned, something that should not be burned at all. No one dared to investigate closely. As disappearances increased, the sisters changed their explanations. They no longer said women were healing slowly. Instead, they claimed some women were released from earthly suffering. Others, they said, were sent away to secret locations where their faith could be tested further. No names were given, no locations were shared. Families were expected to accept this without question. Graves began to appear in the forest, not proper graves with markers, but shallow patches of disturbed earth. Sometimes hunters found bones scattered by animals. When reported, local leaders dismissed these discoveries as animal remains. No investigations followed. The wilderness was vast, and it was easy to hide the truth within it. A few brave men attempted to approach the sanctuary at night. They reported seeing women moving silently through the grounds, their heads lowered, their movements slow and mechanical. They were watched closely by the sisters, who seemed to appear suddenly out of the darkness. Those men never returned for a second visit. Fear kept them quiet. By the late 1820s, rumors reached beyond nearby towns. Stories spread of women vanishing without trace, of a sanctuary where people entered but rarely returned. Some ministers quietly warned their congregations, others defended the sisters, saying Satan often attacked holy places with lies. This division kept any serious action from happening. Authorities were aware of the rumors, but the sanctuary existed in a dangerous gray area. No bodies were officially reported, no written complaints came from inside. The women were considered volunteers under religious care. In that era, religion carried great power, and interfering with it was risky. Officials chose distance over confrontation. Inside the sanctuary, control tightened further. The sisters sensed danger from the outside world. They increased punishments. Women were watched constantly. Underground rooms were used more often. Anyone who spoke of leaving was removed immediately. Other women were told these failures had been taken by God. The forest itself became part of the system. Women who tried to escape were hunted down. Some were found days later, weak, injured, and terrified. Others were never found at all. The sisters claimed the forest had claimed them, a punishment for disobedience. Fear of the wilderness became fear of freedom itself. By late 1830, the disappearances could no longer be ignored. Entire families were missing daughters, sisters, and wives. Church records showed names with no endings, no deaths, no returns, just silence.
Some towns refused to send anyone more, but it was too late for those already inside. One former worker, a man hired years earlier to repair stone walls, finally spoke. He said he had seen pits dug behind the sanctuary, later filled quickly. He said he smelled death in underground rooms. When he asked questions, he was dismissed and warned never to return. His words spread quietly, fueling fear but not action. The sisters responded by retreating further from the world. Gates remained closed at all times. No families were allowed near. Messages were delivered only through trusted church figures. The sanctuary became more isolated than ever. The wilderness helped hide everything. Storms erased tracks, snow covered disturbed ground, animals scattered remains. Nature became an unwilling accomplice, swallowing evidence and protecting the stone walls from discovery. At night, the screaming continued. Some said it sounded like punishment. Others said it sounded like prayer twisted into pain. Either way, it was impossible to ignore. The sanctuary was no longer just a place of fear, it was a place of death. By the early 1830s, it was clear that many women who entered the sanctuary never left because they never survived. Whether through starvation, illness, punishment, or something worse, their lives ended quietly and without record. Their families would never receive bodies, they would never have graves to mourn. This was the turning point. The whispers became accusations, the fear became anger. People began demanding answers, even if they were afraid of what those answers might be. The forest of Maine had hidden the sanctuary for decades, but it could not hide the truth forever. Too many women were gone, too many screams had been heard, too many secrets lay buried beneath the soil. And slowly, dangerously, the outside world began to move closer to the stone walls, unaware that what waited inside was far darker than anyone imagined.
By the early 1830s, silence was no longer enough to protect the sanctuary. Too many women were missing, and too many rumors had spread beyond the nearby towns. What had once been whispered behind closed doors was now spoken openly in markets, churches, and town halls. People were afraid, but they were also angry. Families wanted answers, and patience had turned into suspicion. Pressure slowly reached local authorities. At first, they tried to ignore it. The sanctuary was remote, religious, and protected by influential church figures. No written complaints had come from inside. No bodies had been officially reported. Still, the number of missing women could not be explained away forever. Church records showed hundreds of names with no endings, no returns, no deaths, just absence. In 1832, a small and quiet inquiry was opened. It was not announced publicly. Officials did not want panic or conflict with religious leaders. 2 men were sent to observe the sanctuary. They were instructed only to look, not accuse. When they arrived at the forest edge, they already felt unwelcome. The paths were overgrown, and the air felt heavy. No bells rang, no smoke rose from the chimneys. The gates were closed. After hours of waiting, the sisters appeared. They looked exactly as they always had, calm, controlled, untouched by time. They greeted the officials politely and denied all accusations. They claimed the sanctuary was nearly empty now, that many women had chosen to leave years earlier or had moved on spiritually. When asked to see inside, the sisters refused. They said sacred rituals were taking place and could not be disturbed. The officials left with nothing but unease. Weeks later, they returned with more authority and clearer orders. This time, the gates were open. What they found inside was disturbing in its emptiness. Long halls stood silent, sleeping quarters were bare, personal items were gone. It looked as if people had lived there for years and then vanished overnight. Underground rooms told a different story. Chains were found fixed into stone. Walls were marked with scratches and faded symbols. The smell of decay lingered, even though no bodies were found. Some rooms had no windows and no clear purpose. The sisters claimed these aces were for meditation and reflection. The officials did not argue, but they wrote everything down. Before the inquiry could go further, it ended. Orders came suddenly from higher authorities to close the case. No explanation was given. Notes disappeared. Witnesses were told to remain silent. The officials involved were reassigned. Some resigned shortly afterward. Fear spread quickly. If those with power were unwilling to act, what chance did ordinary people have? Then came the final shock. One morning, smoke was seen rising from the sanctuary for hours. By the time people reached the forest edge, the smoke was gone. The gates stood open, swinging slowly in the wind. Inside, the sanctuary was completely abandoned. No women, no sisters, no signs of struggle, just silence. The sisters had vanished. Search parties were formed. The forest was combed for weeks. Dogs lost scent near the sanctuary grounds. No tracks were found leading away. It was as if the three women had simply disappeared into the land itself. Some believed they had fled under cover of night. Others believed something darker, that they had prepared for this moment long in advance. With the sisters gone, authorities finally searched more deeply. What they uncovered was horrifying. Behind the sanctuary and deep in the forest, mass burial sites were discovered. The remains were old, scattered, and incomplete. Some showed signs of long-term confinement and malnutrition. Others bore marks that could not be explained by illness alone. No names could be matched to the remains. Records were destroyed. Families were told the truth slowly, carefully, and without detail. Many never received confirmation that their loved ones were among the dead. Grief mixed with rage. The sanctuary, once protected by faith, was now seen as a place of evil. The Ashford-era belief in religious authority collapsed in that region. Churches lost followers. Trust was broken. People asked how such horror could exist for decades without intervention. No one had a good answer. The sanctuary was sealed. Officials declared the land unsafe and cursed. No one was allowed to live there. Over time, trees reclaimed the paths and vines covered the stone walls. Nature worked quickly to erase the place, as if trying to hide the shame of what had been allowed to happen. The fall of the sanctuary did not bring peace. The sisters were never found. No trial was held. No justice was served. Families were left with questions that would never be answered. What exactly happened inside those walls? How many women truly died? And how had three women been able to control so many lives for so long? The Ashford name, once spoken with respect in religious circles, became a symbol of fear and failure. It represented a time when belief blinded people, when obedience was valued over humanity, and when silence allowed cruelty to grow. By the time the sanctuary faded into history, the damage had already spread through generations. Children grew up without mothers. Sisters grew old without answers. The truth had come too late. The stone walls still stood, empty and cold, marking the end of the Ashford power. But the story was not over, because even though the sanctuary had fallen, its shadow remained, and some legacies do not die when the doors finally open.
Even after the sanctuary was abandoned and the forest began to swallow the stone walls, the story refused to disappear. People tried to move on, but the land would not let them forget. For decades, no one dared to live near the old site. Hunters avoided it. Travelers changed their routes. The silence around the place felt unnatural, as if the ground itself remembered every scream. Families of the missing women kept searching for answers. Some returned to the ruins year after year, hoping to find a sign, a name carved into stone, anything that could confirm what had happened to their loved ones. They found nothing but broken walls, collapsed tunnels, and earth that looked disturbed in too many places. The forest had hidden the truth too well. Church leaders tried to distance themselves from the sanctuary. Sermons changed. The sisters' names were never spoken again.
Records disappeared or were rewritten. What had once been praised as holy work was now quietly erased. It was easier to forget than to admit guilt. Admitting the truth meant accepting that faith had been used as a weapon. Over time, strange stories began to spread. People claimed the ruins were haunted. Campers who wandered too close reported hearing chanting carried by the wind. Others said they heard footsteps behind them when no one was there. Some claimed to see figures standing among the trees at dusk, women in plain clothing, watching silently before fading into the shadows. In the late 1800s, a group of historians attempted to document the sanctuary properly. They searched old church records, town logs, and family journals. What they found was disturbing. Names of women appeared once, marked as sent for healing, and then vanished from history. No death records, no marriages, no returns. Hundreds of lives simply stopped on paper. One historian claimed to have found fragments of a journal buried near the ruins. The pages were damaged, but some words were still readable. They described punishment disguised as prayer, hunger praised as holiness, and obedience demanded above all else. The handwriting changed suddenly near the end, becoming rushed and uneven. The final lines spoke of fear, of women disappearing at night, and of the sisters preparing for something they called the final cleansing. After that, the journal ended. Attempts were made to investigate further, but progress was slow. The land was difficult to work on, and funding was limited. Some locals resisted, saying the past should remain buried. Others believed disturbing the site would invite something evil back into the world. The ruins were left alone once again. Generations passed, but the legacy remained. Descendants of the missing women grew up hearing the story as a warning. Some were told their grandmothers had gone mad. Others were told they had been too sinful. Rarely was the sanctuary blamed directly. Silence continued to protect the truth. Every few decades, someone claimed to see one of the sisters, a woman who did not age, a woman with calm eyes and a familiar voice. These sightings were dismissed as imagination, but they followed the same pattern. Remote towns, religious gatherings, women in distress, always the same description, always gone by morning. In the early 1900s, a fire broke out near the ruins. Locals said it burned strangely, low and slow, as if feeding on something beneath the ground. When it was over, bones were found scattered among the ashes. Authorities quickly sealed the area again and removed what they could. The findings were never fully released. The story of the sanctuary became a dark legend, passed quietly between people who lived near the Maine wilderness. It was no longer just history, it was a warning about what happens when power goes unquestioned and suffering is called salvation. Modern researchers believe the sisters did not disappear by accident. They planned their escape carefully. They destroyed records, emptied the sanctuary, and vanished before justice could reach them. Whether they lived out their lives under new names or died hidden in the wilderness remains unknown. What is known is this: nearly 600 women entered that sanctuary seeking peace, healing, or forgiveness. Fewer than half returned. Those who did were never the same. The rest were swallowed by silence, hidden by faith, and erased by fear. Today, the ruins are barely visible beneath moss and vines. Nature has claimed the stone walls, but it has not claimed the memory. The land still feels heavy. Visitors still feel watched. Some leave suddenly, unable to explain why. The legacy of the sanctuary is not just about what happened there, but about what was allowed to happen. It is about a time when belief was stronger than compassion, when obedience mattered more than life, and when silence protected cruelty for decades. The sisters are gone. The sanctuary has fallen, but the questions remain. How many women truly died behind those walls? How many could have been saved if someone had spoken sooner? And how many other places like this existed, hidden by faith and distance? The Maine wilderness keeps its secrets well, but sometimes, when the wind moves through the trees just right, it feels as if the past is still whispering, asking to be remembered and warning never to let such darkness hide behind holiness again.